Louis II of Hungary was born in July of 1506, a child of dynastic ambition, yet the heir to a fragile throne. His father, Vladislaus II of the Jagiellonian dynasty, ruled both Hungary and Bohemia, but his reign was marked less by strength than by compromise. Having inherited a realm weakened by years of noble privilege and Ottoman incursions, Vladislaus had little means or will to rein in the aristocracy. The Hungarian crown had become a bargaining chip in the hands of magnates, and the king a figurehead more than a ruler. By the time Louis was born, the rot had already set in. Crowned at the tender age of 2, following his father's death in 1516, Louis's elevation was more symbolic than functional. The real power resided in the royal council, dominated by a handful of barons and ecclesiastical elites, whose loyalty to the crown was conditional at best. In effect, Hungary became a feudal confederation, masquerading as a monarchy. For a child monarch, this environment proved stifling, not merely politically, but psychologically. Education became a contested terrain. Various factions pushed tutors of their own choosing, some prioritizing Latin and courtly etiquette, others emphasizing martial prowess but rarely in a coherent curriculum. The result was a fragmented upbringing. Reports from the royal court described Louis as intelligent and articulate, but easily overwhelmed and prone to sudden mood swings traits that would intensify with age. His early exposure to betrayal, manipulation, and factional intrigue left him with a deep-seated mistrust of those around him. Even in adolescence, Louis displayed an almost pathological need to please conflicting parties, often retreating into silence when forced to choose. Perhaps most destabilizing was his awareness, nurtured by fearful advisors of the threat looming to the south. The Ottomans under Sultan Selim Mehmed, and later his more aggressive successor Suleiman the Magnificent, were expanding inexorably toward Hungarian borders. Already the Kingdom of Hungary was seen as a buffer state, propped up as much for Habsburg interests as for its own survival. Foreign dignitaries visiting Buda noted the fatalism with which Hungarians discussed the Ottomans. Their survival was always framed as temporary. One haunting anecdote from Louis's early years speaks volumes. At age 7, during a ceremonial feast in Buda Castle, a troupe of performers reenacted the siege of Belgrade, a Hungarian victory from decades prior. But as the mock battle unfolded, the child king reportedly burst into tears at the sight of actors dressed as Ottoman soldiers begging his courtiers to stop the performance. Witnesses recorded his distress as extreme, even irrational. Whether it was a reflection of trauma indoctrination or a precocious understanding of his kingdom's fragility, it marked the beginning of a long psychological decline. Meanwhile, the power vacuum at court turned his adolescence into a grooming ground for dependence. Lacking a strong paternal figure, Louis became overly reliant on whichever advisor held sway at the moment, especially Cardinal Thomas Bacach and later George Sapolyai. Each man used the young king to consolidate his own power, reducing Louis's sense of agency. The repeated shifting of loyalties and manipulation of his royal name eroded any consistent political education. The 1514 peasant revolt led by Gheorghe Doza only exacerbated the atmosphere of fear. Though Louis was still a child, the brutality with which the rebellion was suppressed, including the grotesque execution of Dosa by being roasted on a red-hot iron throne, was held up as a warning to all. The incident revealed the fragility of social order and imprinted on Louis a vision of rulership defined by violence, instability, and fear. Court chroniclers noted that he became increasingly obsessed with stories of failed rulers fixating on signs and portents in royal archives. The geopolitical environment offered little relief. The death of Maximilian I in 1519 brought the Habsburg Charles favor to the imperial throne, whose divided attention between Spain and the Holy Roman Empire left Hungary with more expectations than aid. The Treaty of Vienna, signed in 1515, had linked the fates of the Habsburgs and the Jagiellonians. Through marital alliance, Louis was married at age 10 to Maria of Austria, a union more symbolic than stabilizing. Though the marriage was politically advantageous, Maria's presence at court had minimal impact. Reports suggest they lived largely separate lives with little emotional connection. The crown prince remained isolated. Beneath the surface of diplomacy and domestic turmoil lay a deeper current, the psychological conditioning of a ruler raised in an environment of foreboding. From the moment he could comprehend statecraft, Louis was taught that his rule would be one of defense and desperation. His identity as king was not tied to sovereignty but to survival. This fundamental framing a reign defined not by glory, but by delay of collapse set the parameters for how he would later respond to existential threats. By his early teens, Louis began exhibiting erratic behavior that unsettled even his closest advisors. He would reportedly oscillate between bursts of energetic optimism and days of withdrawn silence, refusing to attend council meetings or respond to missives. His courtiers interpreted this as youthful inconsistency, but foreign envoys began noting more ominous traits: a fixation on death, a refusal to discuss military plans, and an inability to assert himself in even trivial decisions. A revealing episode occurred in 1522 when Louis refused to sign a military funding proposal not on strategic grounds, but because a fortune teller had warned him that any document signed on the day of a lunar eclipse would bring death. Though this was dismissed publicly as superstition, privately it raised concern. The Hungarian crown, in effect, was worn by a man already looking toward his grave. The mental architecture of Louis's rule, rooted in insecurity, fragmented education, and looming dread, had been laid before he ever lifted a sword or addressed a general. As he grew into manhood, the weight of a crown shaped by fear would prove not just heavy but crushing. By the time Louis II reached the age of 10, his official minority ended in name but not in practice. The royal council, composed of a fractious web of prelates, nobles, and opportunistic power brokers, continued to steer the kingdom with little regard for the boy's authority. His coronation had served to legitimize their influence, not his. Behind the marble walls of Buda Castle, Louis was becoming a figure of ceremonial presence rather than meaningful control. Throughout his adolescence, Hungary functioned under what might be called regency by inertia. The ostensible goal had been to maintain stability until the king came of age, but the factions entrenched themselves so deeply that they had little intention of relinquishing control. The Archbishop of Esztergom, Thomas Bakach, and later George Szapolyai, Palatine of Hungary, and brother of the powerful voivode of Transylvania, each carved out spheres of influence. Their rivalry became a surrogate battleground for Hungary's fractured identity. For Louis, this meant a suffocating environment of shifting loyalties and opaque agendas. His exposure to these machinations from such a young age did not breed cunning but paranoia. He came to associate leadership not with decision-making but with manipulation, and mistrusted those closest to him, even his secretaries whom he frequently replaced. In one instance, Louis reportedly demanded his chamberlain be dismissed because he had smiled at a jest made by a noble aligned with Szapolyai. The gesture was interpreted as political betrayal. Such hypersensitivity foreshadowed his inability to manage court alliances when they mattered most. While his formal education continued, its quality varied wildly. Tutors came and went depending on who held court favor, and no consistent moral or political framework guided his studies. Latin theology and chivalric ideals were taught, but without synthesis. Louis absorbed fragments of classical wisdom, religious doctrine, and royal duty, but these ideas never coalesced into a coherent worldview. He could recite Cicero, but showed little grasp of statecraft. He knew the Book of Psalms, but struggled with basic diplomatic correspondence. When the Polish ambassador visited in 1521, he reported that Louis had the bearing of a king, but the voice of a pupil. His psychological maturation suffered under the weight of ceremonial pressure. Louis was constantly reminded of his royal role in symbolic terms. He was the heir of St. Stephen, defender of Christendom bulwark against the Turk. Yet these identities came with no practical authority. In private moments, he reportedly expressed a desire to join a monastery or study theology abroad. Such comments were dismissed as youthful whimsy, but they reflected a desire to escape not merely from responsibility, but from the toxic scaffolding of court life. Financial instability further eroded his position. Hungary's revenues had declined sharply due to military expenses and administrative corruption. The country's powerful magnates resisted taxation and jealously guarded their estates. Meanwhile, the royal treasury meant to support border defenses was nearly empty. Louis's own household often ran at a deficit, and there were instances in which palace servants went unpaid for weeks. Such degradation in royal dignity contributed to a deeper sense of helplessness. The nobility, while notionally loyal, were increasingly self-interested. The Diet Hungary's legislative assembly met with increasing assertiveness, demanding concessions in exchange for military support. Louis was repeatedly pressured to issue land grants and noble titles to secure temporary political unity. Each concession weakened the crown further. Behind closed doors, some nobles began to refer to Louis not as king, but as the lad in Buddha. In an era where monarchic power was often measured by personal charisma and martial command, Louis possessed neither. A notable yet disturbing incident occurred in 1521 during the siege of Belgrade by the Ottomans. As news of the city's fall reached Buda, the court gathered in a makeshift war council. Louis, then 15, was reportedly unable to speak. When asked for his opinion on reinforcements, he stared blankly at the floor for several minutes before excusing himself. The silence was interpreted variously as immaturity as illness, but behind it was a more troubling truth: the boy king was already emotionally exhausted by the burdens placed upon him. In his private chambers, Louis began to exhibit behaviors now recognizable as signs of severe anxiety. He reportedly developed insomnia, often pacing through the halls late at night, or sitting silently in the palace chapel for hours. Servants whispered about hearing him speak to portraits of his ancestors pleading for guidance. The court physician, a Venetian named Gabriele Turini, noted that Louis was prone to nervous fevers and recommended rest and isolation, an odd prescription for a monarch expected to unify a nation. In one particularly grim episode, Louis allegedly ordered the burning of several documents from his father's reign, claiming they contained omens of disaster. While the claim cannot be fully verified, court scribes did note a sudden disappearance of charters and missives concerning border policy. Whether this was an act of paranoia or an attempt to erase evidence of past failures, it revealed a ruler increasingly haunted by inherited expectations. Maria of Austria, his Habsburg wife, offered little psychological reprieve. Their marriage, while politically advantageous, never developed into a supportive partnership. Maria was often isolated herself, frequently corresponding with her brother Ferdinand and complaining of the Hungarian court's instability. The couple was rarely seen together in public. One Habsburg envoy described their relationship as chilled by mutual resignation. Meanwhile, Louis's attempts to assert authority took increasingly bizarre turns. On one occasion, he demanded that court ministers address him only in Latin to preserve royal dignity. In another, he ordered that no servant may enter his room without reciting a psalm. These measures, more theatrical than functional, suggest a monarch trying to manufacture control where none existed. The rituals of power had replaced its substance. What Louis needed: stable mentorship, effective delegation, and military preparation, was precisely what he lacked. Instead, he was surrounded by courtiers with personal ambitions and foreign agents who treated him as a pawn. The result was a ruler deeply insecure in his role, vacillating between ceremonial grandeur and helpless retreat. By the early 1520s, with Ottoman incursions increasing and Hungary's military capacity weakening, Louis stood at the helm of a kingdom in crisis, but with no internal compass. His psychological fragility was no longer a private matter. It was becoming a national liability. The specter of the Ottoman Empire had loomed over Hungary for decades, but in the years leading up to the Battle of Mohács, it transformed from a distant menace into a near-certain executioner. For Louis II, this change was not merely geopolitical. It was personal, psychological, and deeply destabilizing. The adolescent king, already brittle from years of manipulation and ceremonial duty, was now expected to lead his people in the face of an existential threat. Yet the nature of that threat and the manner in which it was discussed at court only served to deepen his paralysis. In 1521, the fall of Belgrade sent shockwaves through the Hungarian elite. The city, once the keystone of Hungary's southern defenses, had withstood multiple Ottoman assaults over the decades. Its capture by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent marked a turning point. The fortress fell in part due to the mismanagement of Hungarian reinforcements that Louis had been unable to properly organize or finance. The loss was more than military, it was symbolic. Belgrade's fall was the beginning of what many at court began calling the Long Death. For Louis, the failure seemed to confirm what he had feared since childhood, that his kingship was cursed, that the role he had inherited was doomed from the outset. His correspondence from this period shows a young man both pleading for support and shrinking from responsibility. Letters to his Habsburg relatives are filled with desperate appeals for troops and financial assistance couched in language that suggested guilt more than strategy. "The frontiers are open," he wrote to Archduke Ferdinand in 1522, "and I am without the means to close them. What sin have I committed to be placed here?" This language of fate and punishment was not rhetorical flourish. It reflected a mental landscape shaped by fear, religious determinism, and self-doubt. Louis had been raised in a deeply Catholic environment, where suffering was often seen as divine judgment. In this worldview, his failures as a monarch were not simply political, they were moral failings, possibly even spiritual betrayals. Some at court encouraged this interpretation. A handful of clerics whispered that Hungary's plight was the result of sin at the highest levels of government, including the royal household. Whether Louis believed this fully or merely absorbed the mood, it contributed to his growing sense of personal damnation. In practical terms, the response to the Ottoman advance was haphazard. The Diet of Hungary, now dominated by magnates wary of centralized authority, refused to approve the kinds of broad taxation needed to fund a professional army. Instead, the burden of defense fell on local nobles and fragmented militias. Louis attempted to create a semblance of royal initiative by calling for national musters and symbolic displays of resistance, but his directives were inconsistently followed, often ignored altogether. He was a commander in name only. Within this administrative failure lay a deeper psychological pattern avoidance. Louis began to withdraw from detailed military planning, delegating key decisions to trusted, though often underqualified allies. In particular, he came to rely on Pal Tamori, a former archbishop turned military leader. While Tamori was courageous and devout, he lacked the logistical infrastructure to hold Hungary's defenses together alone. Still, Louis seemed relieved to transfer responsibility. One diplomat from Venice remarked that the king behaves as if the Turk is not his enemy, but God's alone. This abstraction of threat into divine narrative allowed Louis to distance himself emotionally from the tasks of leadership. Yet, when moments of crisis struck, he was often pulled back into reality with brutal force. In 1523, an Ottoman raiding force burned through the southern countryside, unimpeded. Louis ordered a day of fasting and prayer, but offered no tangible military response. Eyewitnesses reported that when he received news of the destruction, he spent several hours alone in the royal chapel, refusing to speak to his advisors. Psychological avoidance soon gave way to reactive lurches toward action. Louis began issuing decrees with erratic fervor orders for mass conscription. One week calls for diplomatic negotiation the next. He oscillated between rhetorical militancy and conspicuous silence. One disturbing habit emerged during this period. Louis reportedly carried a relic of St. Ladislaus, a warrior king of Hungary, on his person at all times, touching it compulsively during council meetings. This behavior, while not scandalous in itself, was cited by multiple courtiers as excessive and disquieting. It was not a source of inspiration, they claimed, but a talisman against doom. Meanwhile, pressure from foreign allies mounted. The papacy, anxious to preserve Europe's eastern bulwark, sent envoys urging Louis to act decisively. Charles V offered limited assistance, but made clear that Hungary would need to organize its own defenses. Even among allies, Louis was increasingly viewed as a weak link. The imperial ambassador in Vienna wrote privately that young Louis is devout, but lacking in vigor. He prays while the border burns. It was not merely cowardice, as some critics suggested. Louis was not unaware of the stakes, but his psychological profile, shaped by early isolation, chronic instability, and fatalistic education, had left him ill-equipped to channel fear into leadership. Fear in his case did not provoke resolve. It induced stasis. At court, rumors of supernatural omens began to circulate, a reflection of the growing sense that Hungary was under divine siege. A comet seen over Buda in 1525 was interpreted as a harbinger of royal death. That same year, a peasant woman near the town of Pate reportedly received visions of a king drowning under a black sun. The account spread widely among the lower classes and even reached the royal household. Louis, though outwardly dismissive, reportedly asked his chaplain whether visions of commoners could contain truth. By the time Sultan Suleiman announced his campaign against Hungary in 1526, Louis's mental state had deteriorated further. He became increasingly reclusive, reportedly refusing to bathe for weeks at a time and sleeping in his clothes. Servants claimed he began to sleepwalk, often found pacing the halls of Buda Castle late at night, whispering to himself in Latin. When one of his guards asked if he was ill, Louis reportedly replied, "Not ill, awaiting." The approach of war did not galvanize him. It hollowed him out. As the Ottoman army prepared its invasion, Louis's court became a theater of contradictions, hurried proclamations of unity, desperate pleas for support, and a monarch who looked less like a commander and more like a condemned man awaiting sentence. This was not the failure of a moment, but the collapse of a man who had never been allowed to grow into the role he inherited. The Phantom of Mohács was no longer a metaphor. It had begun to stalk the halls of power itself, feeding on dread silence and the slow unraveling of royal will. In early 1526, as winter gave way to spring, Louis II began exhibiting what contemporaries might have described as resolve, but which in hindsight bore all the hallmarks of overcompensation. After years of withdrawal hesitation and reactive governance, the king suddenly adopted the trappings of martial kingship with renewed vigor. He summoned the nobility to a royal muster, issued grand declarations of resistance against the Ottoman blasphemers, and commissioned the forging of new banners bearing the cross of St. Stephen. To many observers, it seemed Louis had finally embraced his role as a Christian monarch. But the change was superficial and internally driven by a deepening psychological fracture. The pressure had reached a critical mass. The Ottoman campaign was no longer a distant menace, but a fixed certainty confirmed by Suleiman's mobilization in the spring. Reports of the Ottoman army's size, precision, and artillery capabilities circulated through the Hungarian court like whispered doom. Louis responded with performance. Rather than strengthening logistics or building disciplined regiments, he concentrated on symbolism. He ordered the refurbishment of ancient royal armor, had the cathedral in Székesfehérvár ring its bells day and night, and declared public fasts across the realm. Behind closed doors, however, he remained deeply conflicted. While the proclamations continued, his private behavior became increasingly erratic. Court scribes noted that Louis began to speak in absolutes, declaring that Hungary would be saved by divine favor or lost forever, leaving no room for nuanced strategy. His prayers took on a ritualistic quality. He demanded that a traveling preacher read passages from the Book of Revelation aloud before each council meeting. These displays, cloaked in piety, masked a growing detachment from practical reality. In one peculiar incident, Louis ordered a falconer to release the royal hunting birds in Buda, claiming they would return only if Hungary is to be delivered. When they did not return, he spent several hours in silent contemplation and canceled the following day's audience. His inner circle, unsure whether to interpret these actions as eccentric or prophetic, fell into disarray. Several advisors later admitted that they avoided offering tactical counsel for fear of aggravating the king's worsening temperament. To compound matters, the nobility's response to his mobilization efforts was tepid. Many lords, mistrustful of the crown's ability to lead a successful defense, delayed or minimized their contributions. Some failed to appear altogether. Louis's frustration at these desertions further fed into his emerging duality, the outward performer of royal courage and the inwardly spiraling young man who felt the very ground giving way beneath his feet. The more authority slipped from his fingers, the more theatrical his gestures became. Attempts to assert control extended to wardrobe and posture. Louis took to dressing in ornate ceremonial armor, even in private settings, and reportedly practiced sword drills in the palace courtyard with exaggerated flair. These drills performed not before soldiers, but before pages and servants were said to be disturbingly theatrical, more performance than preparation. The image was clear: a boy raised to be a king was now cosplaying the role in desperate hope that pageantry could summon legitimacy. The illusion of readiness extended to his engagement with military advisors. Though commanders like Paltamori and István Báthory offered cautious strategies, Louis increasingly overruled them in favor of bold, simplistic plans that lacked the logistical support to succeed. One commander proposed delaying engagement to allow Habsburg reinforcements to arrive. Louis refused, citing the dishonor of hiding behind foreign arms. His obsession with personal valor, so long dormant, had swung violently in the other direction. Yet these acts did not spring from confidence. They were symptoms of collapse. The clearer it became that Hungary stood alone, the more Louis doubled down on image over substance. In a letter to Maria of Austria, he claimed, "If we die as kings," followed by a postscript asking her to ensure that his tomb be set among the martyrs, not the monarchs. The line was poetic but chilling. Louis was already rehearsing his death. One especially grim ritual occurred in June of that year. Louis held a midnight mass attended only by his closest clerics, during which he reportedly insisted on receiving last rites in anticipation. Witnesses recalled his pallor, his near-delirious recitation of the Lord's Prayer, and the eerie calm with which he spoke of Hungary's fate. The sacrament meant to prepare the soul for death had been voluntarily undertaken by a king not yet 20. Even among a deeply religious court, this struck many as an ominous sign. Meanwhile, reports of Ottoman atrocities filtered in from the south, mass crucifixions in Serbia fields, razed to ash towns emptied of their populations. Rather than using these reports to motivate and rally resistance, Louis treated them as vindication of Hungary's divine punishment. One chronicler recorded him saying, "The fire consumes what is impure. If we are burned, then we are judged." Such fatalism, far from inspiring morale, left commanders and troops with little sense of a coherent plan. Discipline faltered. Muster points turned into quarrels over precedents and provisions. The army that would eventually march to Mohács was not a cohesive force, but a patchwork of private contingents, mercenaries, and untrained levies. Still, Louis refused to yield. Though advised repeatedly to fall back and consolidate, he insisted on leading the army himself. A dramatic moment came when he donned the sword of St. Stephen before the final march southward. Before assembled nobles, he declared that he would not return to Buda unless victorious. The applause was forced. Behind the spectacle was a growing realization that the king was not simply brave, but possibly unwell. Indeed, contemporary foreign observers began to note his instability. An Italian diplomat reported that Louis seems possessed by a vision of holy martyrdom, and warned that Hungary's fate might be sealed not by Turkish arms, but by the zeal of a desperate child. The term was harsh, but it captured what many felt, but would not say that the king was no longer operating as a rational actor. By July, as the army neared the plains of southern Hungary, Louis became more withdrawn. The grand declarations ceased. He spoke less, stared more. The gaudy armor and prayers continued, but the sense of purpose that had once fueled his outbursts had dwindled. He had performed the role of a war king to its limit, and now stood hollowed by the effort. One of his pages, writing years later in exile, recalled a moment that summer, when Louis stood at the edge of a riverbank, watching the slow current and whispering to himself, "The Danube flows to the sea, but where does the blood go?" It was a cryptic question never answered. The march to Mohács was not the confident advance of a nation prepared for war. It was a slow, faltering procession led by a monarch who had mistaken symbols for strategy, faith for preparation, and fear for fate. The psychological execution had begun long before the first arrow was loosed. Louis was already walking the scaffold. The blade had yet to fall. By August 1526, the Hungarian host had converged near the village of Mohács, an exposed plain bordered by marshland and shallow creeks some 60 miles south of Buda. To experienced commanders, the site seemed tactically indefensible, too open with little elevation, vulnerable to encirclement by cavalry and poorly suited to the smaller fragmented Hungarian force. But for Louis II, it had become a stage, perhaps the final one, on which he would assert the only version of kingship he understood symbolic, fatalistic, and infused with ritualized defiance. From the start, the march to Mohács had revealed troubling signs of command breakdown. Military leadership was fragmented between Palatine István Báthory, Archbishop Pál Tamori, and various nobles more concerned with rank than coordination. Louis had insisted on retaining nominal control, but often withdrew from actual planning sessions, deferring to others, or issuing contradictory orders. As the army assembled in the south, confusion reigned. Some units arrived days late. Others were sent to the wrong location. A few never arrived at all. Food and water supplies were mismanaged. Morale suffered. Many soldiers, mostly levies from noble estates, were undisciplined and untrained, more suited to ceremonial guard duty than open field battle. Foreign mercenaries, including some Bohemian and German troops, complained openly about late pay and unclear orders. These logistical failures reflected a deeper truth: the kingdom's administration was too fractured to support a prolonged campaign. Yet Louis, perhaps aware of this, refused to delay engagement. In his eyes, waiting for reinforcements, or worse, retreating, was not a military calculation but a moral abdication. This fixation on honor over prudence grew increasingly obvious in the days before the battle. Louis was said to spend hours on horseback, reviewing troops not for tactical assessment but to display regal presence. He wore ornate field armor enameled in red and gold adorned with the bejeweled crucifix, and the crest of the Arpad dynasty, a deliberate invocation of Hungary's ancient rulers. It was the attire of a monarch preparing for legend, not survival. Behind these trappings, however, was a man unraveling. Servants reported that Louis spoke little during meals and often took no food. He refused sleep aids and paced his tent late into the night. One physician recorded symptoms of acute anxiety, shaking hands, of fixed stare periods of shallow breathing. When advised to rest before the coming engagement, he replied, "I shall rest in the hands of the Lord." More disturbing still was the emergence of a strange ritual observed by his attendants. Each morning, Louis insisted on touching the hilts of 3 swords, his own the ceremonial sword of St. Stephen, and a relic of the Arpad kings kept in the royal baggage train. He did so in silence, making the sign of the cross after each. No one dared question him, but several believed he was preparing himself not for battle, but for death. This behavior filtered through the ranks. Rumors spread among the soldiers that the king had received a vision of martyrdom, that he would not survive the battle. Such whispers, coupled with poor provisions and growing awareness of the enemy's size, began to sap morale. By the time Sultan Suleiman's vanguard appeared on the horizon, many in the Hungarian host already feared defeat was inevitable. Suleiman's army, in contrast, was disciplined, experienced, and numerically superior. Estimates vary, but the Ottomans likely fielded between 50,000 and 100,000 troops, supported by artillery and elite janissaries. The Hungarian force barely mustered $25,000, composed of scattered noble contingents, irregular troops, and a few hundred cavalry. Worse still, the Ottomans had a unified command structure. Suleiman's generals understood terrain movement and timing advantages the Hungarian leadership conspicuously lacked. Despite pleas from Timuri and other commanders to delay engagement or retreat to stronger ground, Louis insisted the battle proceed immediately. His reasoning was simple but fatal. Hungary's honor could not survive further retreat. In a council meeting the day before battle, when one noble suggested withdrawing to regroup, Louis reportedly slammed his goblet to the ground and declared, "Then let me fall here. If no one else will stand, I will." The outburst was met with silence. His words, though dramatic, sealed the army's fate. On August 28th, as the Hungarian host took its position on the plain, the final breakdown of command became evident. Units were arranged with little coordination, relying on outdated feudal tactics. Communication between the wings of the army was minimal. A modest artillery detachment was poorly placed and short on powder. Cavalry squadrons argued over precedence, while some nobles refused orders unless delivered by the king himself. The battlefield was not a chessboard, but a cracked mirror, every piece misaligned. Louis, however, maintained the theater. He rode among the troops in full regalia, offering blessings and quotations from scripture. Some knights cheered, others watched in quiet disbelief. The moment had the gravity of ceremony, not preparation. One Bohemian captain later recounted that it felt as though we were all preparing for a funeral, ours, or his I could not say. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the low hills, Louis summoned a priest to hear his confession. His words were not recorded, but it was noted that he requested extreme unction be administered again despite already having received it weeks earlier. When questioned, he is said to have replied, "One cannot be too clean for the grave." Even among his closest aides, no one could dissuade him from leading the army personally. Though he had never commanded troops in a real engagement, he insisted on riding with the front lines, citing the example of his ancestors. Whether this was courage or fatalism remains unclear. What is certain is that Louis had ceased to think in strategic terms. He had begun to view the coming clash as an act of purification. The night before the battle, strange occurrences unsettled the camp. A fire broke out in a supply wagon and burned for nearly an hour before being extinguished. Several soldiers claimed to see red lights in the sky, possibly the aurora borealis, or more likely the fires of distant villages torched by Ottoman scouts. Superstition filled the void left by competent leadership. One mercenary captain reportedly warned his men that the king is already dead, and we are marching in a ghost's shadow. By dawn on August 29th, the battlefield was shrouded in low mist. The air was thick, humid, and choked with anxiety. The Ottomans took their positions methodically, confident, and unhurried. On the Hungarian side, discipline faltered as exhaustion, confusion, and despair set in. And at the center of it all stood Louis II, astride his horse in golden armor, flanked by noble banners and hollow ceremony, poised to lead a nation to its reckoning. The battle had not yet begun. But for Louis, the execution had already entered its final act. On the morning of August 29, 1526, the fog over the plains of Mohács began to lift, revealing two vastly unequal forces preparing to meet in open battle. The Hungarian camp was tense, restless, marked by disorder, and a grim sense of inevitability. Within the royal tent, Louis II completed his final preparations. His confession had been made. His armor was polished and fitted. His sword was secured at his side. The king, not yet 21, emerged from the canvas, surrounded by an entourage more symbolic than strategic. Despite the gleam of gold and the embroidered banners fluttering above the image, conveyed not strength, but solemn resignation. Those who observed Louis that morning remarked on his silence. Unlike the earlier days of rhetorical bravado, the king now spoke in brief monosyllabic replies. He nodded at greetings but offered no speeches. Some took this as resolve. Others feared it signaled a collapse of will. His horse, a white Andalusian stallion gifted by a Spanish envoy, had been chosen for its grandeur. Yet when he mounted, it reared slightly, and for a brief moment, Louis faltered in his seat. A nearby captain instinctively reached out to steady him. The gesture went unacknowledged. The formation of the Hungarian army followed outdated conventions. Louis positioned himself at the center of the line, surrounded by his elite cavalry and noble retinue. The army's left and right flanks, led by regional magnates and feudal lords, had little coordination with the center. Artillery pieces, few in number, were scattered unevenly and lacked sufficient crews. Compounding the problem, no centralized communication system had been established. Trumpeters and messengers could barely navigate the crowded terrain. As midday approached, the Ottoman vanguard engaged. They advanced methodically with the discipline of veterans and the precision of centralized command. Louis, stationed among his knights, issued no real orders. According to several accounts, he simply lowered his visor, gripped the pommel of his sword, and waited. The first wave of combat was brutally swift. Hungarian cavalry surged forward but met a hail of Ottoman artillery and Janissary musket fire. The left flank collapsed within minutes. Those who survived the barrage fled in disarray, crashing into the infantry lines behind them. Amid the dust and smoke, commands were shouted but rarely heard. Louis remained on the field unmoving. His standard still flew upheld by a squire who would be killed shortly after. The king's own retinue attempted to organize a rally. Some accounts suggest that Louis charged with his knights in a brief counterattack. Others report that he remained rooted, watching as the slaughter unfolded. Regardless, his presence could not alter the course of events. The Hungarian army disintegrated in the space of a single hour. Nobles were cut down by Ottoman sabers. Foot soldiers fled into the marshes, drowning in the mire. Horses trampled the wounded. Crossbowmen threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. None was given. As the center collapsed, Louis's position became untenable. Several of his surviving companions begged him to retreat. Among them was György Chejte, a knight known for his loyalty to the crown. Chejte reportedly grabbed the king's reins and urged him to flee north. Louis resisted initially, but when a nearby cannonball struck the ground less than 30 feet away, killing 2 pages, he relented. Wordlessly, he turned his mount toward the rear, flanked by a handful of knights. The flight was desperate and disorganized. Louis attempted to reach the relative safety of the Seal Creek, a shallow tributary that curved through the plain north of the battlefield. Rain had fallen the previous night, and the banks were soft, the water level swollen. As he approached, the sounds of battle receded, replaced by cries of the wounded and the wet slap of hooves in mud. His party tried to find a crossing, but their path was obstructed by fleeing soldiers and broken wagons. The terrain offered no safe route. Accounts of the king's final moments are fragmentary. According to a servant who survived the retreat, Louis's horse stumbled while attempting to descend the embankment. The king was thrown from the saddle into the water, weighed down by his armor. The mud sucked at his feet. The current, shallow but rapid, pulled at his limbs. He flailed briefly, then vanished. His companions, under fire and unable to dismount, were forced to ride on. No one retrieved his body during the battle. It was discovered days later by local peasants lodged in reeds a few meters downstream. He was lying face down, his helmet missing his armor, waterlogged and caked in sediment. The once majestic regalia was unrecognizable. The monarch of Hungary had drowned not in combat, but in retreat alone, nameless in the moment of death, buried by the weight of steel and fear. The image was haunting a king fleeing from battle, swallowed by the very land he was meant to defend. Chroniclers struggled to reconcile the symbolic contradiction. Some emphasized martyrdom, casting him as a Christ-like figure sacrificed for Hungary. Others were less charitable. The Venetian ambassador wrote coldly, "He died not of wounds, but of water, and the confusion of his own counsel." For his enemies, the scene was one of poetic irony. Suleiman, upon learning of the king's death, reportedly expressed surprise, even regret. The Ottoman chronicles record him as saying he was brave but unwise. Had he lived, we might have made peace. Whether true or apocryphal, the quote reflected a broader sentiment, that Louis II's demise was less a military defeat than a collapse of mind and state. In the aftermath, the battlefield was littered with corpses, over 15,000 Hungarians dead in just 2 hours. Nearly half the kingdom's aristocracy had perished. Bishops, generals, knights, entire lineages extinguished in a single afternoon. The Ottomans took no prisoners among the wounded. Heads were mounted on pikes. The fields of Mohács became a charnel ground. Among the dead was the notion of an independent Hungarian monarchy. Louis had died without an heir. His passing triggered a succession crisis that would fracture the realm and invite foreign domination. Yet for those who had known him not as a king but as a boy, raised under the shadow of prophecy, the ending was not a surprise. He had not died in battle. He had been executed long before by years of indecision, by the weight of unmet expectations, and by the silent verdict of a role he was never allowed to shape. The Battle of Mohács may have marked his physical death, but his psychological execution had unfolded in slow, quiet increments over court chambers, altar steps, and sleepless nights. And in the end, it was fear that sealed his fate, not cowardice, but the kind of paralyzing generational fear that seeps into institutions and minds alike, until resistance becomes a ritual and retreat a prophecy fulfilled. News of the disaster at Mohács spread rapidly across the kingdom. Survivors staggered northward with fragmented accounts of slaughter, the loss of the king, and the annihilation of the nobility. Entire towns fell into chaos, bereft of leadership and paralyzed by uncertainty. In Buda, once the vibrant capital of a European kingdom, the royal court ceased to function. Maria of Austria. Louis's widow took shelter in a convent and refused public audiences. The royal treasury was plundered by fleeing officials. Hungarian sovereignty, already fragile, dissolved in real time. Yet it was not only political structure that collapsed, it was a psychological order built over decades. Louis II's death did not just trigger a crisis of succession. It tore apart the imagined continuity of kingship in Hungary. The monarchy had survived internal strife before, but never a catastrophe so total, so symbolically terminal. The king had drowned not heroically on the battlefield, but in panicked flight. There was no last stand to mythologize, no defiant speech to canonize. Just mud silence and the stench of failure. Among the peasantry and clergy, interpretations took on an apocalyptic tone. Preachers described Mohács as divine judgment. A popular broadsheet circulating in Bratislava declared the king's death the price of forgetting God's laws. Others spread rumors of a hidden sin, incest heresy, or secret dealings with the Turks' imagined causes for a defeat too immense to comprehend. Louis in death became a vessel for projection, a sinner, a saint, a fool, a scapegoat. But within the nobility, a more chilling realization took root. The system had failed not because Louis was weak, but because he had been made weak. They had crowned a child and stripped him of power. They had allowed court factions to rule in his place. They had whispered divine destiny into his ears while denying him every tool of governance. When the time came for action, he had nothing to draw on but empty ritual and generational guilt. In this way, his execution had not been administered by sword or stream, but by the structure of the realm itself. This was no abstract concept for those who had known him personally. Surviving pages and scribes later described how the court around Louis had nurtured superstition over strategy, ceremony over preparation. One former court musician wrote in his diary that the king had sung hymns more than he read dispatches. An advisor from the chancellery recalled how Louis would sign decrees with trembling hands, only after placing a relic on the inkpot. These were not the eccentricities of power. They were the coping mechanisms of a man placed in a position he had never been trained to wield. Worse still was the lack of closure. Louis's body, once recovered, was given a rushed burial in Székesfehérvár. There was no state funeral, no mass procession. Only a few monks attended under Ottoman threat. The absence of ceremony so dominant during his life was glaring in death. Even his final resting place became unstable in later centuries. Ottoman occupation and religious wars would desecrate the royal crypts. Today, no one can say with certainty where his remains lie. The impact on Hungary was devastating. With Louis dead and no direct heir, a succession crisis erupted. The Habsburgs, through Louis's marriage to Maria, claimed the crown. But so did John Zapolya, the powerful voivode of Transylvania, who had been gathering his own army and had notably not joined Louis at Mohács. The kingdom fractured into rival courts, each claiming legitimacy. Hungary, once a keystone of Central Europe, became a battlefield of competing foreign and domestic powers. The Ottomans exploited the disarray. Buda would fall to Suleiman in 1541, permanently severing central Hungary from Christian Europe. The remaining territories splintered into Royal Hungary under Habsburg control, and the Eastern Hungarian kingdom ruled by Zapolya's successors, both mere shadows of the unified realm Louis had nominally ruled. And yet the psychological residue of Louis's reign endured. His story became a cautionary tale repeated by historians, clergy, and political theorists for generations. For some, he was a tragic figure undone by fate. For others, he was proof that ceremonial kingship without real authority was not only useless but dangerous. Protestant pamphleteers of the Reformation era used Louis's death to attack Catholic fatalism, accusing the Church of fostering submission and neglect in the face of real threats. Jesuit writers in turn framed him as a martyr to Christian virtue, but the most compelling and disturbing interpretations came from those who viewed his death through the lens of mental collapse. A century later, a Jesuit scholar in Vienna wrote of Louis as a man executed not by sword but by fear itself. The phrase captured something deeper than political failure. It acknowledged that beneath the armor and titles had been a soul unshielded, crushed by the weight of divine expectation, unearned guilt, and the paralysis of unprepared rule. An especially macabre reflection emerged in 17th century Hungarian folk memory. Among rural communities, a legend developed that Louis's ghost wandered the banks of the Danube, searching for his lost crown. In some versions, he could be heard weeping. In others, he was silent, dragging chains made of golden scripture pages. The details shifted, but the core image remained a ruler condemned to haunt the land he could not save. The haunting was not just metaphorical. The trauma of Mohács left psychological scars on Hungarian political culture. Future monarchs were judged not only on their military prowess, but on whether they possessed the decisiveness Louis lacked. Even into the 19th century, Hungarian politicians invoked his name as shorthand for royal weakness and courtly excess. The term Mohácsi atok, the curse of Mohács, entered the language to describe any failure brought on by cowardice, disunity, or premature optimism. And perhaps most poignantly, no portrait of Louis from his lifetime survives. Paintings made after his death were imagined likenesses, often idealized, sometimes eerie. They show a young man in princely robes or shining armor, always serene, never afraid. But these were illusions crafted to obscure the truth of a ruler who had been undone not by treachery or tyranny, but by the quiet erosion of courage over years. If kingship demands resilience, Louis was never offered the conditions to develop it. He had been dressed in symbols, drowned in incense, and buried beneath obligations he never chose. The psychological execution began long before Mohács. It began in a cradle ringed by prayer books and court whispers, and ended in a muddy creek where even his own name was lost to the current, if only for a while. In the years that followed Mohács, the death of Louis II took on a mythic resonance, but the practical effects were far more concrete and corrosive. Hungary, no longer a unified kingdom, became a contested prize between the Habsburg monarchy, the Ottomans, and the partisans of John Zapolya. The result was a nation carved into thirds Royal Hungary under Habsburg control, in the west the Ottoman-occupied Central Territories, and the Eastern Hungarian Kingdom, later known as Transylvania. This tripartite division would endure for more than a century. But for those who had served under Louis or who had studied his reign in the immediate aftermath, the trauma of his collapse was not confined to maps or borders. It lived on in legal reforms, religious reorientation, and philosophical debates about the nature of kingship itself. To understand this, one must look not only at what Hungary lost, but how the perception of leadership changed in the minds of those left behind. In Vienna, the Habsburgs adopted a markedly different approach to governance in Hungary. Ferdinand III, who claimed the crown through his marriage to Louis's sister Anna, introduced stricter administrative oversight, imported foreign advisors, and sought to centralize control over military functions. Behind this approach lay a silent rebuke of Louis's passive ceremonial style of kingship. Though Ferdinand too struggled to contain the Ottoman advance, his method, bureaucratic, legalistic, and often harsh, reflected a broader reaction to what had occurred at Mohács. A king, it was now agreed, could not afford uncertainty. He could not afford to rely on symbols. Even the church, long a bulwark of Louis's spiritual worldview, began to shift its posture. Clerics in the Habsburg sphere of influence tempered their language, emphasizing divine grace in balance with human action. They no longer preached that prayer alone could save the kingdom. The implication was clear: Louis had placed too much faith in ritual and not enough in command. In more intimate records, letters, diaries, and marginalia, a different picture emerged, more human and more unsettling. Several former courtiers wrote personal accounts of Louis's final years, many unpublished until much later. A secretary to the royal chancellery, Benedek Ilishazi, wrote candidly that the king had feared each day more than the last, and that his decisions sprang not from counsel but from dread. Another court official anonymously penned a brutal summary: he wore the armor of saints and the skin of a child. From these perspectives, the psychological execution of Louis II was not a moment but a process, a slow suffocation by expectation, structured by institutional weakness and spiritual fatalism. His inability to assert authority was not merely a failure of character, but a predictable consequence of a system that exalted mystique over maturity, purity over preparation. He was not raised to lead. He was raised to represent, to stand as an icon between Hungary and its doom. And when that doom arrived, the icon cracked. Stranger still were the fringe interpretations that emerged over time. In certain legalist tracts of the late 16th century, Louis's reign was used as a cautionary tale about over-centralization of symbolic power. The idea of the ceremonial sovereign became shorthand for a monarch who was present in body but absent in purpose. These works, though obscure, influenced later Enlightenment thinkers who viewed kingship as a function of responsibility rather than divine appointment. In some sense, Louis's failure helped sharpen the argument for accountable government, though at an extraordinary human cost. Even within Hungary, where Louis might have been remembered with sentimental reverence, the tone remained ambivalent. Folk traditions remained haunted by his death. In some stories, he was the wet king, cursed to wander the banks of rivers and warn others before floods. In others, he was the king, without voice, a mute specter who approached sleeping nobles and vanished before morning. These tales carried more than fear, they carried warning. Louis had become less a martyr than a monument to what happens when fear consumes the crown. One final anecdote preserved in a local priest's journal decades later speaks to the legacy of his psychological collapse. Near the site of the Sale Creek where Louis drowned, a stone cross had been erected in his memory. It stood alone in the marsh, often submerged during floods. Each spring, peasants from nearby villages would leave small offerings at its base, not prayers for the king, but charms for strength, courage, and the ability to make the hard choice. The monument had ceased to be about Louis himself. It had become a shrine to what he could not do. Thus, the psychological execution of Louis II was more than the disintegration of one man. It was a rupture in an entire mode of governance, a final indictment of ritual without readiness of a crown that gleamed too brightly for its bearer to see the path ahead. His death, pitiful and alone, was a reflection not just of personal weakness, but of a collective failure to prepare a leader for the realities of power. It would take centuries for Hungary to reestablish anything close to sovereignty, and even longer for its monarchs to be remembered as more than figureheads. But Louis, forgotten in life, exhumed in legend, remained a caution etched in national memory. His fall was not merely a tragedy. It was a verdict. The death of Louis II of Hungary at Mohács marked more than the end of a reign. It crystallized the psychological toll of failed kingship in an era when monarchs were expected to embody both sovereignty and salvation. Though slain by circumstance as much as by the Ottomans, Louis's demise was no simple battlefield casualty. It was the culmination of a long erosion a ruler brought to the throne, too young, conditioned by symbols instead of statecraft, and ultimately undone not by a sword but by the weight of his own helplessness. In the long arc of Central European history, Louis's fate became a dark milestone. His death signaled not only Hungary's fall to partition, but also a broader reckoning with the fragility of inherited authority. For the Habsburgs who followed, the lesson was harsh, but clear legitimacy demanded administration force and discipline, not prayer alone. For Hungarians, the trauma of Mohács and the perceived curse it left behind served as a painful reference point for later national crises. What endures from Louis's life is not a chronicle of deeds, but a warning cloaked in silence, a caution against elevating ceremony above capability and against confusing divine appointment with practical governance. In a time that demanded decisions, Louis wavered. In a battle that demanded leadership, he vanished. His execution had no headsman. It came through delay, deference, and decay, slow, quiet, and complete. A life crushed by expectations, his reign left behind not a throne, but a caution echoing quietly across centuries that fear left unchecked can govern even kings.